Hello everybody. As a brief introduction, my name's Adrian Colivray. I lead the captive advisory team for Willis Towers Watson within the strategic risk consulting section. My background, insurer, broker, captive manager, captive consultant, last 11 years in captives management and consulting. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about captive domicile selection. I don't want to get too close to that, it gets a bit echoey. And plus I get hidden, I'm too small, so I'll stick out to the side a little bit. Captive domicile selection. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking there was only Guernsey really in the mix here on the basis of the representation today, but there are other domiciles out there. I can assure you. Some of them even have a value proposition that's different to the Guernsey one, or in some cases superior. No, I shouldn't say that. No, that's get told off. So we heard from Alison and Marcus earlier some of the thought processes that they went through in selecting their captives, selecting where they were going to locate them, the reasons behind, and some of this will be a bit of a recap of that. There is a lot of information here, so I'll try not to bore you too much with most of it, but it's one of these subjects that you think you can be crammed in, and I was asked to write 800 words on this recently for a newsletter to go along this, and I thought this is going to be a real stretch. In actual fact, I really struggled to get just 800 words because there's actually so much to discuss. Sorry, that's me bigging up my part. That's me. And so we have a number of things to consider. And in the olden days, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that maybe the selection of domicile might be related to mediocre skiing conditions or beaches or golf courses or the like. Obviously, that may have been the case in the past. These days, there's a number of different things, and I've selected just a handful of them to talk to you about today. Now, it is a delicate balancing act. There's a number of things that we need to consider as we go through the process. Some of these things may not be obviously incorrect as you go through, but you might start to see a bit of friction if you select the wrong location as you go through. You might have... Look, let's be quite frank, it's not the end of the world if you choose the wrong domicile, okay? There is the option to move. There are re-domiciliation capabilities between a number of jurisdictions. There is also the option to set up and essentially lift and drop into a new one, so you can do it. There are costs related to that. There is time related to that. There's complexity, all of which you want to avoid if you possibly can. So, having said that, and it was mentioned earlier that a captive should be looked at in terms of the long term. Absolutely. So it is very often you might have a look at what your problem is today in terms of trying to define what you want to do today, the issues that you've got to resolve, how you resolve them. But the reality is that as your captive evolves, it's going to require different things. Those different things might have a different appetite as far as the regulator's concerned, as far as how they're going to be subject to capital, solvency, all of these sorts of things, which should be considered at the outset. So it is important, and we've heard about the introduction of stakeholders from other people as well, to speak with as many stakeholders within the organisation as possible, to understand what the expectations, what the likelihood is, what the potential of your captive might be over the next 5, 10, even 15 years. I mean, I was speaking to a company earlier, they said they look at things generationally. So they're looking at what might need for the next 50 years, not just the next 5 years. And that's something that we had to build into the captive feasibility study, which is fun. So, starting with perception. So the first thing I'm going to mention is reputational. Okay, reputational is one of those things that, quite frankly, can be a bit of a difficult one to pinpoint. Sometimes, and look, I spent 6 years working in Cayman, okay, lovely place, but a lot of people when you say, okay, let's look at Cayman, go, oh, hold on a second. The name John Grisham has not been friendly. The reality is it's not as bad as it actually is made out to be, and there's a lot going for it as a domicile. However, for some companies that's just a no. let's just push it out. We're not even going to consider it. We need to look at other options. So that's that. Okay. Corporate responsibility and policy alignment. So there will be things within your annual reports, within your internal governance structures that will dictate some of the things that you can and cannot do. Some of them may align to the structure, the capabilities, the locations. You know, your tax policy, for example, may well say that you're not going to deal with zero tax jurisdictions. You know, we need to be aware of that, and we need to have a look and see how that links in with the overall. Substance, we heard earlier, Alison actually talking about the fact that they already have some substance in Guernsey, and so therefore that was one of the considerations. I think Marcus also said for Luxembourg that was a consideration as well. It is important to have that. It is important from the perspective of having stakeholders near the location. It is important from the perspective of being able to justify why you chose that domicile in the first place. Because at some point it's possible that HMRC or somebody of that nature will knock on the door and say, right, okay, you need to justify this captive. That will be one of the components that will help to justify that position. And the last one on here is country by country reporting. So there is a requirement to list where you have subsidiaries. If, for example, and I'm not picking on the Cayman Islands because I'm actually pro the Cayman Islands, okay, but if you have the Cayman Islands on your country by country reporting, and that creates a red flag for the company from a wider perspective, then the Cayman Islands probably isn't the right location for you. Next one, program requirements. Okay, so here we're talking about what you're going to put into the captive and how it relates to the risks and how the captive can operate. Luxembourg, that Marcus was talking about, is a reinsurance, predominantly reinsurance. There are some direct captives, but predominantly it's a reinsurance captive jurisdiction. So if you want a direct captive, that's not the location. Okay. If you look at admitted versus non-admitted, Luxembourg, obviously from a reinsurance perspective, but Malta from a direct perspective, being able to write directly for European risks is probably a good alignment. Likewise, if you're looking at non-admitted or you're looking at a reinsurance type program, the number of options open up to you. Okay, so that's important. The life and the non-life, there are a lot of regulators that say they will do both. Some of them will not look at the captive from a licensing position as a composite insurer. Okay, they will look at it as a life and as a non-life, ask you to report and do the solvency, and then you have essentially the stacking of the collateral requirements as a result. Not ideal in some situations. If you can get a composite, then it can promote, and we're talking about maybe EB and P&C risks being merged in, how they can be viewed, how they will be assessed. The coverage type, there are some that people don't like. Regulators don't like, domiciles don't like. I'm going to throw a controversial one out there, surety. Okay, I've had captives with surety business running through them. Some regulators say it's not insurance. Okay, others will say, okay, it is insurance, you can have it in your captives. So again, important to get the right regulator to fit the nature of business. And the first party versus third party. A captive, in its essence, should be for the purpose of first party risks. However, there are captives with third party risks with different shades of grey. Okay, going from joint ventures all the way through to bringing third-party risk, because US companies need to demonstrate, many of them, that there is diversification. One of the diversification capabilities or requirements is third-party risk, and so therefore bringing that in. But domiciles will view that very differently. If we look at Singapore, for example, Singapore have a very linear view in terms of ownership to risk. And we recently had an example where a captive was moved from the Cayman Islands by another company. Okay, not Willis Towers. Okay, moved to the Cayman Islands, got to Singapore, realised, oh, hold on a second, we need two captives because the regulator won't let us have just the one. So that instead of having the one captive, they then ended up with two, which wasn't ideal either. So the first to third party is important to understand what it is you're going to do. Also, a grey area for this is around affinity business. If you're going to be writing affinity business, some will view it as a commercial risk. Depending on the nature of it, some might see it as a captive risk. It's a bit of a grey area and definitely worth a conversation with a regulator prior to jumping in two-footed into a captive solution for that. going to go through these fairly quickly because obviously we want to have a bit of leg stretch time at the end and ideally a few questions for the rest of the panel as well. Structural needs. So we heard earlier about protected cells. We heard earlier about pure captives. There are other types. I've mentioned group captives here. I've mentioned risk retention groups. These things are only available in certain locations. A risk retention group, for example, is something formed under the Liability Risk Retention Act. It's a federal US act, and so therefore it's only for US captives. Likewise, we mentioned TRIA, that's only for US captives as well. So it's important to align the structure that you're going to have to the domicile. Guernsey, I will, all right, just give a bit of a plug for Guernsey, has a wide-ranging breadth of structures that are available to it. It has the pure captives, the cell captives, the incorporated cell captives, right? So it is very good from the perspective of breadth of different structures that are available. Others also have that as well. I'll leave those nameless, but just to mention that. So making sure that you line up your needs to the structure, to the domicile, is going to be part of that process. Resources. You can't do this alone. We've just heard from Richard and Adele in terms of the captive management functions that are required. In addition to the captive management functions, you've got all the external providers, you know, in terms of the auditors, the actuaries, the lawyers. All of these people need to be part of the process. Now, ideally, they're all in the domicile that you're located. There are certain locations, which again shall remain nameless, who are operating captives. All of the resources have to be done in other countries. Okay, that's not ideal from the perspective of demonstrating that mind management and control is in the location where the captive is located, particularly when you're talking low or no tax jurisdictions. So having those resources, those capabilities in the domicile is actually very important. And again, yes, okay, Guernsey have all of that. They have a very diverse and experienced infrastructure. I say this grudgingly. Parental resources at the bottom is also very important and one of the key indicators. You know, there will be people who will need to be involved in your captive. Even if you have a protected cell captive, you will probably want somebody to go over and sit with the manager every now and then. Okay, even if you don't have to go over and sit on a board or do the board meetings and the formality of all of that. So making sure that you are within proximity, that you have the capabilities. And let's remember that some of these stakeholders who will be going over will be senior people. So it's not just a 2, 3, 4 hour meeting. It's the time it takes to get to the plane, go over, spend the time there. You know, you're talking a couple of days potentially out of their diary for the purpose of managing that captive, if it's a pure captive, if they're on the board of directors. So make sure that you've aligned that. And if they like golf, then maybe select someone with some life golf. Here we go. So regulatory and accounting. Excuse me. Oh no, we're okay. So tax wants to come up, and I really don't want tax. I wanted to avoid tax completely, if I'm entirely honest, and I had to put it in. I put it there as a red thing, as a I don't want to touch it, you know, but I had to put it in, and it keeps wanting to come up. So, regulatory, solvency, capital, reporting, stability. What do I mean by that? The solvency, you're going to have a certain amount of capital in your captive in order to maintain it. This is an insurance company, it's a regulated insurance company. You need to make sure that it's maintained and monitored as such. Now, the amount of solvency that you will require will vary from domicile to domicile. Okay, if you look at, we mentioned Luxembourg, we mentioned Malta earlier, they operate Solvency 2. Solvency 2 is punitive. You know, there are benefits to it, but they are punitive from the perspective of the amount of capital that's required, the amount of solvency. They're punitive from the reporting requirements, all of which add cost and complexity to the process. Now, there are very good reasons for using those locations, line to substance, access to direct, etc. Within accounting, I'm referring to reserving positions, so the equalisation provisions that are available in Luxembourg, for example, could be beneficial, particularly if you have a low frequency, high severity profile. Having that opportunity to provision a lot of equalisation reserves over there is potentially a fantastic opportunity. So, solvency, capital, reporting, stability. I've mentioned stability. What do I mean by that? Okay, I've set up captives in the past in locations where the regulator has been, come to us, we love you, okay? We'll do everything for you. And then you get to a triennial review, and all of a sudden, the capital requirements have gone through the roof. They want multiple times the maximum limit, everything is completely different. And in some situations, I've actually had to move that captive to another jurisdiction just because it's completely irrational and completely irrelevant. Also, there are certain locations that might be more driven by political requirements and don't necessarily have the resources in domicile to be able to manage the captives in the way that you might want to, give you the time frames, etc., that you might want. So stability is key. And yes, Guernsey has long time and stability and everything else, okay? So I'm trying to add a bit of Guernsey in here, right? Okay, I'm just... now treatment as well. So we need to have a look at the accounting procedure. There are some locations, particularly if you're looking at multi-year policies, where the treatment between the deferred acquisition costs and deferred liabilities might vary. That can often have an impact, particularly at the outset when you first establish the captive, that the fact that they don't tie up creates essentially a deficit which needs to be managed as part of your capital. So at the outset, it's probably more of an issue than for a mature captive, but there are certain things like that that need to be considered as you go through the process. Different domiciles will treat it differently. The regulator might take an alternative position on some of those aspects, but need to make sure that understand how that accounting treatment is going to be organised and managed. Looking at the time, we're looking good for the moment, and I'm nearly at the end. We're good. Unfortunately, got tax. Sorry? Yeah, just fill it out. It's all right. I've got questions. There's going to be loads of questions. Everybody's awake and not falling asleep yet. So tax. A few things. Firstly, the OECD G20. So base erosion and profit shifting. Number of pillars around base erosion and profit shifting that need to be considered. I've put down here substance, economic rationale, transfer pricing. Some of these will be known to you, some of them will not. Substance we've talked about in terms of having minded management and people locally and just making sure that you have alignment with the captive, with the domicile. Economic rationale, why would the captive assume the risk of the parent, and why would the parent use the captive? What is the benefit for that? There needs to be a bit of a balance sheet transference. They need to be looked at independently. So those sorts of things. Transfer pricing. What premium are you putting in? Is it the right amount of premium? Is it benchmarked to market? Is it assessed based on actuarial assessments? Guidance suggests that you should have a look at both. But transfer pricing is going to be one of those. Now, clearly, the location of that will have a bearing in terms of how important that base erosion and profit shifting element is. From a BEAT, what I mean by BEAT is the base erosion and anti-avoidance tax that's in place in the US, and that's in respect of risks essentially being ceded to alien insurance companies. Now, that is mainly an issue for global insurers rather than captives, but it is an area that you should look at if you're looking at doing that, because there are certain thresholds in terms of size of the business. There are certain thresholds in terms of the base erosion percentage that is required, and for a captive, generally speaking, they don't hit that base erosion percentage because they're a relatively small part of the overall company, but it's important to review that and assess it from a US perspective. Now, coming down the line, we've got also the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. The Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 really is the attempt to try and get everybody on a level playing field. Try to avoid revenues being moved that are generated in the UK, for example, and moving them to, I don't know why I'd say Ireland, but maybe Ireland as an example. Just trying to make sure that firstly, that the allocation of the profits is in the right location, but also in the second part, having a global minimum level of taxation. Now, clearly, from a captive perspective, that will require some consideration in terms of how it's managed, how it's viewed from a consolidation perspective, how certain domiciles are going to be managed in that respect. So going down the line, we've got the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 to consider as part of the captive utilisation and captive involvement. From an EU mandatory disclosure, so DAC 6, the UK, to my knowledge, has opted out of it. Okay, but from a European perspective, there's a requirement to notify the revenue authorities in the event that you get into an engagement that might have a tax benefit. So if you go into a location that is a lower level of tax, then you have a duty to disclose. Not only do you have a duty to disclose, but captive managers have a duty to disclose. Any counterparties who might be involved in the process have a duty to disclose, etc., etc. Okay, so depending on location, make sure you understand DAC 6 and the implications in terms of whether or not you want to disclose and whether that changes your view in terms of domicile location. Controlled foreign corporation, obviously variance around the world. It's important to have a look in terms of how that might impact the company, whether you're going to be a controlled foreign corporation, a non-controlled foreign corporation, and the implications from a tax perspective, because again, that might have an implication. I should also mention just as a side note, for a number of Guernsey, Isle of Man companies, for example, the whole alignment to UK tax system has been a point of contention around this whole sort of OECD and everything else. So there's a number of captives that have actually elected a UK tax election for their Guernsey and Isle of Man captives. That is possible. There are implications. It does require some legal counsel in terms of separation of duties and making sure that it's all organised appropriately. But that UK tax alignment should not detract from the utilisation of a Guernsey captive or an Isle of Man captive or however else that can be done as part of that process. Charities or non-profits, we need to be careful as far as they're concerned to ensure that we don't create an unrelated business income tax, because they don't pay tax, right? And if we create an insurance company and the insurance company becomes subject to tax, then that could be an issue. In the US, there are ways and means, because it's much clearer what is an insurance company, and basically being able to make sure it's not an insurance company for tax purposes is much easier in the US than it is in Europe. So just making sure that you align the structure to meet the obligations and the internal sort of tax treatment for the entire organisation is key. And lastly, premium taxes. Relatively easy from a UK perspective, right? We just pay it at the outset, and any sort of reinsurance or whatever is fine. There are complexities, and we've got some very good tax people that can provide advice. If we look at other jurisdictions, there are increased complexities. So we look at the US, you've got the state taxes, you've got the self-procurement taxes, you've got the federalised excise taxes, and then you've got cascading taxes as well. Then you add the big base erosion and anti-avoidance taxation, lots more complexity around that, all of which the location of your captive could have a bearing. And so therefore it is important to consider that. So you'll be pleased to hear that we're at a summary. The summary is that there are a number of things to consider around domicile selection. Just because you like it or because it's next door probably isn't necessarily the way of choosing your captive. But there are professionals out there who will provide you guidance, who will provide you the support, who will need to understand what it is you are wanting to do today, what you're wanting to do in the future, and make sure that all of these aspects that have been considered or been discussed today are aligned to that strategy as part of that selection. What else have I written here? Because a domicile can work doesn't mean it's suitable. Okay, that's just a side thing. Further down the line it might be an issue. You might have some friction, etc. But ultimately it can be moved. Okay, it is important to assess the alternatives, but to come back to my statement at the beginning, it's not the end of the world. Captives can be re-domiciled if necessary. You can set up, lift and drop into other locations. There are ways and means. It might add a bit of cost, but if that cost is worth the change, then that's what we can do. Okay, so that is it. And I think if I open up questions for the entire group, we probably have 10 minutes? 10:15. Do you want to come up and take questions? I don't know. We haven't rehearsed this, so...
Everybody answer it.
Yeah, look, I don't want to answer all of their questions, so let's be clear about that. Okay, any questions for anybody? I should have probably checked that first before inviting everybody else. No, doesn't look like we have. I think everybody wants an early stretch of legs. Steve? No, I think we're good. Alrighty, unless I'm being blind, I think we can finish early and... we do have one question at the back, yeah.
Sorry to delay everyone.
No, it's good. It makes us feel a little bit more important than somebody else. Yeah.
That's what I'm here for. You talk about domiciles and relocating. What about domiciles, treatment of amalgamation? So you have a captive in one area, but you want to maybe merge it with another captive in your group. Are there territories or domiciles that like that and ones that don't?
I think most domiciles will have some form of capability, whether it's actually a detailed capability or whether it's we will make it work kind of capability. I know sort of jurisdictions like Guernsey do have quite a lot of experience with that and have vehicles that specialise in the merger of captives, particularly when we look at legacy risk type vehicles. Richard, I don't know if you want to...
It needs a bit of thought, actually.
Yeah.
I've done a couple of those in the past, moving captives from one domicile to another. And there is a process in it. And actually, in one case, we moved, following a sort of merger and acquisition, we moved one captive from the Isle of Man to Guernsey to combine various things. I mean, we got there in the end, but I think a lawyer drafted a sort of process for us that was going to cost 5k and take a month, and it did actually take quite a while in the end. But most of those were due to sort of how the shares went up to the ultimate groups, and all those sort of issues had to be ironed out. But from a process, it was straightforward, but it just took some time because of unexpected events. Just a warning.
I mean, it's complicated, sorry.
So I was just going to say, where there isn't complex reinsurance structures in place going back years and years, you can also just look at commutation, or novation, which is really a much sort of simpler and cleaner way of transferring risk, and then just dissolve the captive in the chosen one that's not going to be amalgamated. So there are other ways.
I think it's complicated by going across domiciles. Internally, there are different ways and means, and it's important to assess the different ways. As Adele mentioned, there is the option for the commutation side of things, but then there are opportunities for mergers and things within domiciles, and there's a few different ways. And it's important
I'd also just add a comment. We had one going back a couple of years now, but people were using Dublin because they wanted direct right. That was the primary reason, and we helped a client move from Dublin to Guernsey, and they could no longer direct right, and that caused a lot of headache and a lot of expense, I would say. So I appreciate the comment that you can pick up and move, but to your point, there's potentially a structure that sits on the front end of the captive, and then there's a structure that sits on the back end, and depending on how complex that is, that can be difficult.
Yeah, and it might not just be a clean cut as well. I've had some that have had longer term share plans and agreements in place that have taken quite a lot of time to sort of go through the process. So it is important to structure it and organise it appropriately. But to the point, it can be done. It's a bit of a pain, but it can be
And
done.
by the way, if there's a secondary question, which you may have been coming on to or not, you might wonder about a cell and transitioning from a cell into a wholly owned captive. I think hypothetically, I'm not sure if it's actually been done as a transition, converting a cell out of its PCC into a standalone company. I have been told it's possible, but the truth is the process would really be that you novate, as you mentioned, you novate the business out into a new captive. You would form a new captive and then sort of pop the cell, just to let you know that. So you could overcomplicate things by thinking you have to go through a deep process. So actually, if you want to go into a new type of vehicle, it's possibly easier just to set one up there if it's a new captive in a new domicile and flick everything over into it. if that makes sense.
Good. So I think we still have time for another question, if there's another question. Otherwise, we'll break. Good. We'll take that as a break. Good. Thank you.
Thanks very much.